And I'm going to lay my cards on the table. I think it's a disgrace. I think that unions are almost acting as a manipulative force. I think that they are trying to hold your average Joe to ransom. You're trying to hold the country hostage, and I think it's inappropriate. I worry that people's lives are going to be impacted, their health, certainly lifestyles will be impacted, but people's health. What do you say to that?
Well, I can see you're in two minds on this one, Michelle.
I'm definitely not. I could have gone a bit harder, but I won't because I like you. But
I mean, what I would say is, look, these things don't come out of a clear blue sky, do they? Why is it that millions of workers across the country have suddenly stood up and said, actually, what's going on is not acceptable, we're going to fight back against
because
this?
They know they can.
It's not, no, it's not. That's simplistic, with all due respect. It's because we're in a cost of living crisis and people are struggling to make ends meet, and people are being told once again that they have to pay the price for an economic crisis they did not create. They were told the same thing in 2008, by the way, with the global financial crisis. They had to pay the price of that through austerity. They're now being told, as a result of the cost of living crisis, they've got to pay the price of that. They're being told they have to accept real terms pay cuts after 14 years of appalling pay increases, you know, very paltry pay increases. And the idea that workers have suddenly woken up one morning and said, actually, we're just going to create a bit of trouble today, that's not how it works. You know, people are struggling to pay their mortgages. People are worried about heating their homes. People are worried about buying Christmas presents for their children. And when, after, you know, the last 14 years of the previous economic crisis, they're approached again by their employers and by the government, who tell them, actually, you've got to tighten your belts even further. At some point, people say enough is enough. At some point, people say, look, I'm not prepared to accept this anymore. You're coming to me again saying I must accept a real terms pay cut. Why should I accept it? And at the same time, Michelle, I would also point out that they see that city bonuses are increasing quite handsomely. Executive pay is going up quite handsomely. Some of our big
what's that got to do with the price of fish? A private banker, what's he got to do with an heir?
Because it goes to the heart of an economy that is fundamentally unfair. When executive pay is going up quite handsomely and city bonuses are going up quite handsomely...
But taxpayers don't pay. Taxpayers don't pay your private sector's CEOs.
I don't think you can say, well, because taxpayers pay the wages of public sector workers, therefore they should have kind of less of a right to strike, or they're somehow,
I wouldn't say that.
What they're doing is more morally unacceptable than any private sector worker. We've got some of our corporations which are recording record profits at the moment. We've got a government that thinks it's appropriate to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. There's an economy that's fundamentally unfair, and people see it and they feel it, and they've decided to say at long last, this is not acceptable, we're going to fight back, and we shouldn't condemn them for it.
You suggested that Michelle's question was simplistic. It is simplistic to just say the economy's unfair because somebody gets X and I want X, or I don't get enough of that. The people in the private sector that you're criticising for receiving high pay are not only not in the NHS, which would be the right comparison. If your point was NHS senior executives are getting, you know, massive bonuses and frontline staff aren't, I would really think you had a strong point, but that wasn't your argument. Your argument was that bankers are getting paid more.
That was one example.
The thing about the people, let's take the private sector per se. It's people in the private sector who pay taxes that then go on to pay for our
those
public
bonuses
sector.
Are indeed taxed.
And those people receiving more money, I mean, as far as, and then we also attract people who invest here and innovate here by lifting the bankers' bonus cap. And as rightly pointed out by Michelle, the bankers' bonuses are taxed to a very high level, much more than your key workers that we're talking about.
The point about the private sector, it shouldn't, Alex, be a race to the bottom. It shouldn't be counterposing what people in the public sector get and are asking for
Paul,
with what people in the private sector get and are asking for.
You took us
made that comparison.
No, I'm saying there are some people at the top of society who are doing very handsomely. There were some people who did very nicely out of the pandemic, and the people I named. And people at the other end of the scale see that, and they think, well, hold on a second, this is not fair. And why is it? This is a question I'd like answered. Why is it that when it comes to ordinary workers going on strike, trade unions going on strike, people are quick enough to say you're holding the country to ransom?
No, I'm talking about the coordination of these strikes. That's where I've got my problem.
So why is it that when a multinational company or some chief executive of some big corporation puts pressure on governments and says, look, unless you give us a low tax regime, a low regulation regime, as lots of multinational companies do nowadays, we're going to up sticks and move our operations abroad. And governments give way to them the whole time because they don't want to see capital flight and lose the investment. Why is that not holding the country to rank? Why do we indulge the rich when they make demands on government, but we don't indulge people at the other end of the scale when they make
Because you want to have a go at wealthy people, you've twice ducked the point I was making, which is that people in the banking example that you chose and others, when they do well, it means a higher level of income for the state. And in the end, your politics of envy, which you encourage, is very reductive. And where you say, well, why do people think it's different? And why can't we take a different position on workers and so forth? The point is, most people in this country, NHS workers and others included, see it. And you know what, Paul? You see it too.
Alex,
and you willfully avoid that answer because you don't... Either you don't have an answer or it's easier to have a go at wealthy people.
It's not the case at all. What about your politics of envy when you look at trade unionists who are taking strike action, who have had to bear the brunt of economic crisis over the last 14 years, whose real wages have fallen, whose living standards have crashed, whose mortgages are going up, who are struggling to make ends meet, and you say, actually, you're not worth that, we're not going to pay you that. Is that not a form of politics of envy? Because you think that cleaners and rail workers and firefighters and nurses perhaps don't deserve that sort of
And at this point, Paul, you find, I think quite clearly, you can watch it back, you simply put words in my mouth. I didn't get a chance to speak about this strike yet. You've just had it out with Michelle.
I'm drawing attention to the double standards of saying that...
expressed on this strike
let him go.
is that they should continue negotiating. After all, patient outcomes will be significantly affected by a strike of this scale and on this coordinated level. After all, if there was no effect on patients, you'd wonder why people employed in these jobs were doing them. There must inevitably and necessarily be a significant and detrimental effect to patients, and it seems to me the right thing to do is to carry on negotiating. After all, there was an offer on the table. It may not have been exactly what people wanted, but the right thing to do is carry on negotiating rather than walking away.
Yeah, but the reality is, Alex, and you know this, that one way of exerting pressure on an employer or on a government to increase an offer is to say, look, we're that angry about it, we're going to run a ballot for industrial action, and we will take industrial action if we get a yes vote, as many unions have now done.
I didn't say they shouldn't be allowed to. I said they shouldn't.
Right, but that sometimes, quite often, will force the employer or the government to come back to the table and say, of course we want to avert a strike, therefore we're going to increase the money on the table. I mean, considering what we've seen in terms of the economy over the last 14 years and austerity and sluggish growth and the impact on people's disposable income and living standards and stuff, it's quite remarkable we haven't had more strikes before now. It's quite remarkable that we've had to wait this long before actually something starts to break out.
Your arguments about the right to strike are, of course, correct. People are entitled to withdraw their labour. Nobody should be compelled by the state or others to work. But there are, of course, consequences, potentially, to withdrawing your labour. And certainly there are consequences to withdrawing your labour outside of a regulated strike, which is not what we're talking about here. But I'm not arguing people shouldn't be able to strike or even to coordinate a strike, or I find it unattractive when they do this thing over Christmas, try and make it as hard as possible.
I don't think it's unattractive. I think it's appalling and shameful.
All right, well, I'll choose my words, you choose.
Yeah, I do. It's awful.
But I'm not arguing that they shouldn't be allowed to strike. I'm arguing that they shouldn't. And you will realise, I think, quite quickly that public sympathy can go one of two directions. You are assuming now that the public will universally, because of the respect we hold people doing these work, these kinds of jobs in, will be on their side. And broadly speaking, right now, it probably is, actually.
Oh, I don't know. Not in my inbox.
If you take your labour out of hospitals for this length of time over Christmas, see how opinions change.
Alex, let me tell you, I've been a firefighter for 25 years. I've been on strike before. I've stood on picket lines. I've withdrawn my labour. It's an agonising decision. People always wrestle with their consciences. I did. All of my colleagues did. I've no doubt that nurses will be doing at the moment. Other public sector workers will be doing at the moment. But there comes a point where you have to accept people who've got a valid case. And if you say, OK, we accept that you've got a valid case, but you know what, we're not going to allow you that weapon of strike action because we think it's morally wrong. And effectively you're saying to people, just take what's thrown at you, boys and girls. Take what's thrown at you.
I didn't say
because
that.
It would be wrong to fight back and take any sort of industrial action. But that's the logic of what you're saying.
Do you recognise that, I mean, because I have to go to break, so this is a very brief question that I've got. Do you recognise that there are a lot of perks, for example, in being in the public sector, so you keep referencing the comparison between the private sector and the public sector. If I just think, for example, just about your employer contributions towards pensions, for example, you're talking upwards of 20% often in the public sector. In the private sector, I can quote you a number of businesses where your employer contribution is a 3%.
I think, look, I mean, I certainly don't want to focus just on the public sector. I mean, there have been some strikes in the private sector recently, and I think there will be more. I think some of the pay and conditions in the private sector are appalling. But I go back to the point I made to Alex, Michelle. It shouldn't be a race to the bottom. It should be about saying, actually, we want decent pay and conditions for everybody. If that means levelling up elements of the private sector to the public sector, then so be it.
Well, there you go, everyone at home.